So far, 8 vice presidents have had to take over when the president died or left office. With the 2 oldest presidential candidates ever, chances are pretty high that we'll soon see the 9th.
The late, great Hannibal Lecter is a wonderful man.
But you know what I'd do if there was a shark or you get electrocuted? I'll take electrocution every single time. I'm not getting near the shark. So we're going to end that. We're going to end it for both.
So it's person, woman, man, camera, TV. It's actually not that easy, but for me it was easy.
What I've been able to do with the COVID, with dealing with everything we have to do with, look, if we finally beat Medicare.
The vice president is the second highest ranking official in the U.S. government, but it sure doesn't feel that way. We can't escape their name during election season, but then rarely see or hear much from them until it's time to campaign again. Trump's been treating his VP search like it's the season finale of The Apprentice, while Kamala Harris has struggled to be taken seriously after 4 years on the sidelines. It all feels like a boiling hot mess. So, given the present stakes, I wanted to find out what exactly vice presidents do all day. Do they have any real responsibilities, or is the job really just sitting around waiting for their boss to die? What makes someone qualified to serve as VP? Who decides, and why isn't it the American voters? This is why the next vice president could change history. Roll the intro.
Vice President Johnson has left the hospital in Dallas, but we do not know to where he has proceeded. Presumably, he will be taking the oath of office shortly and become the 36th President of the United States.
Thank you to my partner on today's video, PDS Debt. Credit card debt sucks. I have talked about this before. I have been buried under so much credit card debt before, more than I care to admit to. And now it feels like everything's costing more these days, from cereal to cell phones, and many people are at the point where they're buying the same things, but they have to put it on a credit card just to get by. And that can add up easily, and those debts can really weigh on you and feel like you'll never get out from under them. PDS Debt can help. PDS Debt has customized options for anyone struggling with credit cards, personal loans, collections, or medical bills. They offer multiple programs and solutions tailored to your specific needs, budget, and financial goals, and they have a team of people ready to help you with your debt journey. PDS Debt is offering a free debt analysis. It only takes 30 seconds. Head over to pdsdebt.com/Miller to get your free debt assessment today. You'll receive a full breakdown on how to save on interest each month and the quickest way to take care of your debt. Everyone with over $10,000 in eligible debt qualifies, and there's no minimum credit score required. If you're making payments every month on your debt, but your balances just won't seem to go down, this program could be for you. Stop waiting and start saving. Take advantage of PDS Debt's free debt analysis. Go to pdsdebt.com/Miller to complete the quick and easy debt assessment in just 30 seconds. That's pdsdebt.com/Miller. Thanks, PDS Debt. Today, we call vice presidential candidates the running mate of the presidential hopeful. This correctly implies the VP's central role in campaigning. They're typically announced at the party's national convention after being vetted by a selection committee and approved by the candidate. There aren't hard and fast rules about the process. Dick Cheney led Bush Jr.'s VP search and then chose himself, so really anything can happen. Vice presidential candidates are expected to hit the fundraising and campaign trails hard, securing undecided voters by balancing the ticket in ways that complement the presidential nominee's weaker or more controversial areas. A good example of this was Lyndon B. Johnson, whose decades of experience on Capitol Hill and Southern roots balanced the youthful liberal Northeastern Kennedy enough to deliver key states and the presidency. On the other hand, vice presidents have also sunk campaigns, like in 2008, when the idea of putting Sarah Palin a heartbeat away from the presidency was too much for at least 2 million swing voters to stomach. Today, we don't get to vote for the vice president. They're merely an appendage to our presidential vote, bundled into a single ticket. But things didn't always work this way. Originally, the vice president was a presidential candidate in his own right. A great many subjects were hotly contested throughout the Constitutional Convention. The vice presidency wasn't one of them. The position was more or less an afterthought. According to historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr., a fortnight before adjournment, a new drafting committee invented the vice presidency over a weekend and submitted the idea to the convention. There was no great enthusiasm, but no one could think of anything better, and the clause went into the Constitution. Basically, someone realized they hadn't accounted for filling an emergency vacancy at the presidency and was like, shit, we'll come up up with something by Monday. And on Monday, everyone went, that'll do. This trash energy follows the vice presidency through numerous evolutions and has led to a long list of amusing one-liners about the office. For many years, a vice president's most important job seemed to be coining another disparaging phrase about the position. Our very first vice president, John Adams, started off strong, calling it the most insignificant office that ever the invention of man contrived or his imagination conceived. The vice president's only official duties are 1, replace the president in the cause of death, disability, or resignation, and 2, to preside over the Senate, meaning they're responsible for things like casting tie-breaking votes and presiding over election vote counting. And though the past few years may lead you to believe differently, those are usually incredibly mundane responsibilities. Vice President John Nance Garner, who served under FDR, once described the role as not worth a pitcher of warm spit. Since the vice presidency was primarily created to fill an emergency vacancy of the presidency, the same qualifications logically apply. Candidates must be natural-born U.S. citizens, at least 35 years old, and U.S. residents for at least 14 years. But for the first few election cycles, nobody ran for the vice presidency. In the beginning, each elector would cast 2 undistinguished votes. Whoever won a majority was named president. The runner-up became vice president. The idea was that the vice president should be the second best candidate for president, since his whole purpose was to fill that role if needed. This worked as planned for precisely 2 election cycles. We got John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, both future elected presidents. But then, in 1800, chaos reigned. It's been said that the founders didn't even anticipate the party system we know today, so it must have been quite a shock that by the election of 1800, both the Federalists and Jeffersonians were running unified tickets, instructing electors to use both of their votes for the party's choices, which they did dutifully. Unfortunately, in 1800, they failed to decide on who would withhold 1 vote from Aaron Burr so that he'd receive the second most votes, making him vice president as intended. Instead, Jefferson and Burr wound up tied with 73 electoral votes each. Oops! Since Burr refused to concede, the tie meant that presidential selection was referred to the House of Representatives, where each state got 1 vote. After more than a week of deadlocking, negotiating, and deadlocking some more, Thomas Jefferson ultimately came out on top. But people were disturbed to see just how close Aaron Burr, someone the voters did not intend for the presidency, had come to winning the presidency. States quickly began petitioning Congress for an amendment to clarify the process. Quick being the key word. By June 1804, the 12th Amendment had been ratified by the states and enshrined into law, creating a new separate voting category for vice president. Instead of casting 2 undistinguished votes, electors now cast 1 vote for president and 1 for vice president, who, by the way, aren't allowed to come from the same state. Thanks to the vice grip that the party system has on the balls of democracy, we pretty much take it for granted that electors will vote for their party-approved pairing. Technically, they could vote differently than they pledged to, they just tend not to. If you're interested in untangling the whole mess that is the Electoral College, I made a whole separate video about it that you can check out after this. For now, just understand that the 12th Amendment fundamentally changed the vice presidency, from the world's shittiest consolation prize into the world's second highest ranking politician with 0 actual political power. After getting elected, presidents have tended to sideline their VPs quickly and with great enthusiasm. It wasn't until 1940 that presidential candidates even got a say in choosing their running mate. Early on, the party would just insert someone who represented all the candidates' shortcomings and symbolized his mortality, so it's easy to see why they weren't always best buddies. In the modern era, we've seen vice presidents take on real responsibilities, but for the bulk of American history, presidents tended not to embrace their vice president or delegate any real power to them. Before the 1960s, vice presidents didn't even get a desk in the executive office building, which I guess makes sense. Like, if you're not really doing any work, why do you need a desk, you know? And despite also being part of the legislative branch as president of the Senate, vice presidents were no more warmly regarded on Capitol Hill than in the White House. Senators often guarded their power and weren't keen to make friends with the presiding officer they neither chose nor had the authority to remove. In fact, VPs were so rarely needed in Washington that many of them lived in their home states pursuing other interests, like writing history books, playing poker, and of course getting shit-faced. For example, James Monroe's vice president, Daniel Tompkins, was reportedly drunk in New York for their entire second term. And Martin Van Buren's vice president ran a tavern as a side hustle. Okay, actually being VP sounds kind of like a sweet gig. Where do I sign up? So in 1841, when Vice President John Tyler returned home to Virginia after after President William Henry Harrison's inauguration, he was braced for an uneventful term. But little more than a month later, opportunity knocked at his door, informing him that Harrison was dead. Typhoid got him. Classic 1841 cause of death. Vice President John Tyler was a power-hungry bully who lacked the charisma to ever be elected president himself. And when he saw his moment, he seized it. Tyler went on to stage what historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr. calls a constitutional coup. While Congress argued about what powers Tyler was entitled to and what he should be called, Tyler got a local judge to administer the presidential oath. And because William Henry Harrison was the first president who'd actually died on the job and the protocol was murky at best, Tyler's power grab worked. He successfully shut out the cabinet and spent the rest of Harrison's term wielding all the powers of a president, objections be damned. The members of the Whigs, the party that helped elect Tyler, called him his accidency. But did this succession fiasco teach everyone a valuable lesson about giving a little more thought and care to the selection of the vice president? Of course not. So in 1864, President Abraham Lincoln secretly dropped his first vice president, Hannibal Hamlin, a strong foe of slavery, in favor of Andrew Johnson, an old-fashioned Southern Democrat who had remained in the Senate even after his state, Tennessee, seceded. This had made Johnson a hero in the eyes of the North, a traitor to most Southerners, and a symbol of hope for reunification among Lincoln's advisors. But after Lincoln's assassination, Johnson's true loyalties were revealed. After the Civil War, Johnson handed amnesty out like candy and delegated civil rights to the states, paving the way for the black codes that would later become Jim Crow laws. Johnson was also the last U.S. president to own slaves. His lenient Reconstruction policies pissed off Republicans who were eager to punish the South. Ultimately, Johnson was impeached by his political enemies, but ended up being acquitted by a margin of 1 vote. So instead of being removed, he stayed in office as a lame duck for the rest of Lincoln's term. But though Johnson effectively sabotaged Reconstruction, vice presidents continued to be treated as little more than election pawns. By the early 20th century, we had a few examples of more generous presidents who'd somewhat empowered their VPs, but these exceptions were few and far between, and vice presidents remained entirely at the mercy of the presidents they served. That is, until the lack of communication became a problem of nuclear proportions. Between being selected as FDR's running mate for his 3rd term and taking over the presidency when FDR died a few months later, Harry Truman met with President Roosevelt a grand total of 8 times, and only 2 of those were private one-on-one conversations. Truman had been shut out of White House goings-on so completely that he didn't know anything about the atomic weapons program, let alone the strategic intricacies of the foreign policy chess that his predecessor had been playing with other world powers. I mean, most jobs do a pretty terrible job with onboarding, but can you imagine the stress? Truman was determined not to put anyone else through what he'd experienced, and he made sure his VP was a member of the National Security Council, a participant in cabinet meetings, and a recipient of regular security briefings. Truman gave the vice president a seat at the foreign affairs table, a seat Richard Nixon would soon eagerly fill. After Truman left the White House, Nixon spent 2 terms as vice president under Dwight D. Eisenhower, determined to build a reputation as an international affairs expert and close advisor to the president. Where past VPs had sat back, drinking on the job, running taverns, and generally giving 0 fucks, Nixon attempted to shape the role to his aspirations of power. But at the start of their first term in 1953, Nixon was an ambitious 40-year-old World War II vet and first-term senator, while 62-year-old Eisenhower had a nearly 40-year military career under his belt. With that level of experience, Eisenhower wasn't all that interested in Nixon's advice. Most often, young Dick was sent to Capitol Hill as the attack dog on the Democrats. Though Nixon performed well in his duties, Eisenhower wasn't keen on taking Nixon under his wing. But the vice president wasn't without mentors. Secretary of State Foster Dulles encouraged Nixon to advise him on most foreign topics and leaned on him as a surrogate Secretary of State. This experience proved invaluable and helped Nixon mold himself into a viable presidential candidate for 1960. Though he didn't make the mark he'd hoped on Eisenhower's administration, Nixon did transform the vice presidency from political dead end into a launching pad to the presidency. Years later, Nixon would harbor great disdain for his own VP, Spiro Agnew, who failed to live up to Nixon's ambitious example. During the Watergate scandal, Nixon even called Agnew his insurance policy against being removed, believing that nobody wanted him out badly enough to risk putting Agnew in charge. But I'm getting ahead of myself because we can't talk about the American vice presidency without discussing Lyndon B. Johnson. LBJ was the first of what I'll call senior VPs, a seasoned politician whose role was to anchor and advise a less experienced presidential candidate. In 1960, facing an experienced contender in Richard Nixon, Kennedy Kennedy turned to Party Majority Leader Lyndon B. Johnson to bring political and geographical balance to his ticket. According to the National Constitution Center, the decision to bring LBJ, who had just lost to Kennedy in the Democratic primaries, onto the ticket was a shocking move. But they needed Southern support, and Johnson was a big old bully from Texas with the right reputation. And while conventional wisdom holds that Johnson successfully delivered the South, managing to flip several states that had voted Republican during the Eisenhower years, some survey data from the period indicates that Johnson wasn't even that popular in the South, which could indicate that voters genuinely just wanted Kennedy. In other words, it's hard to tell who voters are really voting for, but the VP might have less sway than we actually think. Whatever the motivations, in 1960, JFK and LBJ won by the smallest popular margin of the century. Johnson became the first vice president to receive an office in the Eisenhower Executive Office building, much closer to the center of the action than the Veep's traditional digs on Capitol Hill. He was also appointed chairman of some important committees, but Johnson viewed most of his assignments as busy work and was frustrated to find himself boxed out of Kennedy's inner circle, especially on legislative issues where he, a Washington veteran, could have been useful. Then, Kennedy was assassinated, and Johnson suddenly shot to power. Just hours after the assassination, Lyndon B. Johnson was sworn in as president on Air Force One and embarked on the daunting task of calming a hysterical, traumatized nation and ensuring continuity in the presidency. Less than a week after JFK's untimely demise, Johnson was pressuring Congress to pass Kennedy's stalled Civil Rights Bill. According to presidential historian 𝗪𝗏𝗡𝗏𝗧, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 would never have passed had JFK survived. In 1964, Lyndon B. Johnson and his running mate, Minnesota Senator Hubert Humphrey, beat Republican conservative Barry Goldwater by the largest popular vote margin in history. Between Johnson's promotion to president and his official election, there was no vice president. At the time, there was no constitutional way to replace a vice president who had vacated office. Congress was acutely aware of this gap. After Truman's rapid ascendancy to the presidency, they'd spent 8 years eyeing Eisenhower's spotty health and fishing for a solution. After JFK's death, not only did they find themselves with yet another president with known health problems, but the next two people in line for the job were 71 and 86 years old, respectively. Enter the 25th Amendment. In February 1967, the 25th Amendment clarifying presidential succession became law. Section 1 established that the vice president would become president when the presidency became vacant under one of three circumstances: death, resignation, or removal from office. Section 2 gave the president the power to name a new vice president should that office become vacant, with permission from Congress in the form of a majority vote in both houses. Section 3 granted presidents the authority to transfer power to the vice president temporarily to be restored later. For example, if a president has to undergo anesthesia for an operation and needs 1 month to recover, he or she could theoretically make the VP acting president for just that month before reclaiming the role. Section 4 is where things get spicy, and because it deals with removing an unfit president, it's likely the section you've heard rumblings about in the Trump era. It's also the only section that hasn't seen any real-world action since becoming law. It holds that if a president becomes unfit to perform their duties, the vice president and the majority of cabinet members can get together and write a note to Congress being like, this guy's batshit, he's got to go, and then immediately the VP becomes acting president. But the president doesn't have to take it lying down. He or she can challenge the claims, at which point the VP cabinet coalition has 4 days to convince 2/3 of Congress to vote to remove the president for the duration of their term. And I say duration of their term because, unlike impeached leaders, presidents removed under the 25th Amendment are allowed to run again. New York Times chief White House correspondent Peter Baker recently spoke about Section 4 and how drastically its implications have changed.
What we saw in the last few years is that there are circumstances in which a president is not going to admit or be willing to lose the powers of the job. And that means a vice president has to certify that his or her own boss is unfit for duty. How hard is that for a political figure, even if they believe it? But Pence couldn't do that. He couldn't see himself being the person to make himself president, right? We are asking a vice president to take it upon themselves to overturn the will of the voters, in effect, and declare himself or herself the president.
Interestingly, it's the same sense of principle and respect for the rule of law that prevented Pence from rejecting the 2020 election results like Trump wanted. And though Trump treated him like a traitor over it, Pence wasn't being particularly noble or even political. He was doing the bare minimum of his already minimal job. According to a CNN fact check, the vice president's role in elections is ceremonial. There is nothing in the law about Pence doing anything about calling on tellers and announcing the results. The Constitution only gives him the power to count the votes. Until that very last second, Pence was an extremely vanilla vice president, exactly the sort of inconsequential yes man Trump would want as second in command. The New York Times put it well, observing that as Trump's running mate, the devoutly religious Pence lent a sheen of evangelical piety to a reality TV star who bragged about grabbing women's genitals. As Trump's vice president, Pence pivoted from his previous commitment to laissez-faire conservatism to run defense for Trump's escalating trade war. Indeed, Pence was so accommodating that he was even nicknamed the sycophant in chief. Yikes. As we've discussed, this dismissive dynamic was the prevailing model for vice presidents for much of American history. But Pence's vice presidency wasn't quite business as usual, because his time in office broke a more recent tradition, a decades-long streak of so-called executive vice presidents. No vice president has transformed the office as profoundly as Walter Mondale. Despite the gradual expansion of vice presidential powers since Truman's day, it remained a shit job that nobody wanted. Vice presidential historian Joel K. Goldstein summarizes the era. President Lyndon B. Johnson had abused Hubert H. Humphrey. Spiro Agnew had resigned in disgrace. Gerald Ford had spent 9 unhappy vice presidential months as far from Richard Nixon and Watergate as he could get. And Ford's well-intentioned promise to give Nelson Rockefeller a significant role did not work, and he dumped the vice president from the 1976 ticket. And that was all in a decade. Despite Nixon's best efforts when he was VP, it was actually Minnesota native Walter Mondale who was the first vice president to become a genuine partner to his president, Jimmy Carter, from the campaign to the disgraceful end. Fun fact, among many other firsts, Mondale participated in the first vice presidential debate. After the famous Nixon-Kennedy standoff in 1960, the public wouldn't get another debate for 16 years. This was because in 1964, incumbent LBJ was so far ahead in the polls that he was like, nah, I'm good. And Nixon, as presidential candidate, for obvious reasons, skipped the next 2 cycles as well. So in 1976, the League of Women Voters stepped in and sponsored 3 debates, including the very first vice presidential debate. And Mondale's influence only grew from there. In 1976, he wrote a memo to President Carter pitching a new scope for the vice presidency. It began by acknowledging that defining an appropriate and meaningful role for the vice president has been a problem throughout the history of this country, and went on to propose specific ways to reposition the vice president as a key advisor, including receiving intelligence briefings, inclusion in high-level meetings, and direct access to the president. President Carter understood the vision and cooperated wholeheartedly. According to the Washington Post, Mondale became part of Carter's inner circle and functioned as an integral part of the White House. Mondale, a lifelong public servant, proved instrumental in Carter's administration. He traveled widely, even helping broker the peace deal between Egypt and Israel. But despite his stellar track record as vice president, Mondale failed to parlay the position into his own presidential term. His association with the deeply unpopular Carter administration likely worked against him during his presidential run against the beloved Reagan in 1984. Mondale lost by a landslide. But though Mondale left D.C., he wouldn't soon be forgotten. The Mondale-Carter model would define the vice presidency for the next 40 years. Ronald Reagan sent George H.W. Bush on numerous foreign missions, who in turn influenced USSR policies. Bush put Dan Quayle in charge of the Competitiveness Council and made him an important legislative emissary. Bill Clinton leaned on Al Gore to manage his Reinventing Government initiative. By the turn of the century, vice presidents were finally getting some juicy responsibilities. And then Dick Cheney came along and said, hold my fucking beer, and became the scariest second in command this country has ever seen. But though Cheney did in many ways mastermind the so-called war on terror, it's important to understand that he wasn't exactly being sneaky.
While it's true that he successfully pushed for various policies that he favored, he was pushing on an open door. George W. Bush wanted to go the places that Cheney was taking him to go. He didn't resist. In fact, Bush has never, in all the research I've ever done, nobody's ever told me that Bush told them that Cheney made him do something he didn't want to do.
So Cheney was incredibly influential, but only because Bush made it so. In his second term, Bush strayed from his vice president's policies, and Cheney found himself on the losing end of countless issues: same-sex marriage, Guantanamo Bay, and what to do about Donald Rumsfeld, to name a few. Still, when Joe Biden became vice president, he was careful to declare that he planned to be less influential than his predecessor. But in reality, Obama needed Biden in similar ways that Bush needed Cheney. Both required vice presidents with the experience and credibility to help them navigate Washington and foreign relations. Yet the fact remains that vice presidents have very few official duties, so their powers are almost entirely in the hands of the president they serve. That's why, despite the decades-long streak of influential second bananas, we've seen back-to-back veeps without real teeth. We already touched on Pence's lackluster term and subsequent alienation, but what about current Vice President Kamala Harris? When Biden chose Harris as his running mate, she'd served less than 4 years in the Senate. Meanwhile, old Joe had been skulking around Washington since she was literally 8 years old. He doesn't exactly need her help navigating the system, you know? According to the New York Times, Vice President Harris was chosen because no other candidate scored as highly with Mr. Biden's selection committee on so many of their core criteria for choosing a running mate, including her ability to help Mr. Biden win in November, her strength as a debater, her qualifications for governing, and the racial diversity she would bring to the ticket. Since becoming the first woman and the first African American to hold the office of vice president, Kamala Harris has found herself in what allies have called a damned if she does, damned if she doesn't conundrum. According to the New York Times, she's been expected to not do anything to overshadow Mr. Biden while navigating intractable issues he has assigned her, such as voting rights and illegal immigration. That's on top of the racism and sexism, like how foreign officials have allegedly proposed that Harris meet with the first lady of their country instead of the leader. I mean, vice presidents aren't the most exalted figures, but she's the second-ranking official of the United States, getting treated like a spouse abroad. Not that she's had as much time as her predecessors to travel. For the first 2 years of her term, the Senate was split 50-50, and Harris's tie-breaking vote secured a Democratic majority. In such extremely polarized times, she's had to stay within 24 hours journey of the Capitol anytime the Senate was in session, just in case her vote was needed, which it was 33 times. That's 2 more than the previous record holder, who was John Calhoun, who broke 31 ties in 1832. But her contributions in the Senate haven't convinced anyone that she's ready to become president. As the campaign has heated up, Harris has begun taking on more public responsibilities, leading the White House's new Office of Gun Violence Prevention, defending the president's faculties, and calling for more empathy for Palestinians and for focus on creating a post-conflict plan for Gaza. It's hard to feel like that last one is anything more than empty virtue signaling meant to win back some of the voters Biden has alienated by continuing to support Israel's genocide. She's also been hitting the campaign trail hard on abortion rights and doing what she can to endear herself to women voters. Look, every vice president is technically a heartbeat away from the top job, but in the 2024 election, the sentiment feels less like a cute aphorism and more like a threat. The vice president is the backup president, but we are rarely encouraged to think about it that way. The vice president is the co-president, the support player, the ticket balancer, even the lapdog. Even though the VP's entire job is to replace the president in the event of death or incapacitation, never have death and incapacitation felt so perilously close as they do for these 2 candidates. These vice presidents will be campaigning not only to support the president, but to convince the public that they'd be a suitable substitute if and when their ancient running mate kicks the proverbial bucket. The number one concern among undecided voters is that Joe Biden is too old to serve another term. And after his depressing performance at the first debate and some verbal snafus lately, even loyal Democrats started copping to the same fears. Technically, until the convention in August, almost anything is possible, but for now, most Dems swear they won't push Biden out without his consent, and those close to Biden insist he's not going to quit. Biden himself has said as much as well. Let's assume that's true and that Biden won't voluntarily drop out. Here are the other options. 1. Nothing changes. Biden and Harris are the Democratic ticket in the fall. Harris will have to support Biden unequivocally on the campaign trail while simultaneously proving herself as a viable presidential candidate. 2. Biden replaces Harris with another VP pick. It's not unheard of for presidents to drop their incumbent VP. But consider this, the last time a president dumped their incumbent VP was in 1976 when Ford replaced Rockefeller with Bob Dole. But they gave the public a lot of notice. Vice President Nelson Rockefeller announced he wouldn't run with Ford a full year ahead of time. So logistically, it's unlikely. Or 3, Biden drops out involuntarily because he's incapacitated in some way. And the scenario also stops him from being president in his current term. Kamala Harris would become the president, and it's likely the DNC would also hand her the nomination. According to Reuters, 7 senior sources at the Biden campaign, the White House, and the Democratic National Committee with knowledge of current discussions on the topic claimed in early July that Vice President Kamala Harris is the top alternative to replace Biden if he decides not to continue his re-election campaign. And that's just the Democratic half of the race. In the opposite corner, we have the slightly more energetic 78-year-old Donald Trump, who's been milking his search for a VP for all it's worth, delighting in watching the hopefuls put on ass-kissing political theater for his benefit, finally settling on this guy.
I think that what Trump should do, like if I was giving him one piece of advice, fire every single mid-level bureaucrat, every civil servant in the administrative state, replace them with our people, and when the courts, because you will get taken to court, and then when the courts stop you, stand before the country like Andrew Jackson did and say the Chief Justice has made his ruling, now let him enforce it.
J.D. Vance opposes abortion in any instance, even in cases where a woman is only pregnant because she was raped or she was the victim of incest. J.D. Vance also pressured the Biden administration last year that they should withdraw the rule that prevents law enforcement from tracking down and prosecuting women who have crossed state lines to have an abortion.
If history serves as an example, whoever Trump picks as his second-term VP would traditionally become the Republican nominee in 2028, which would be a big deal. But that would require us to assume that Trump won't rewrite the rules to give himself unlimited terms, and frankly, I'm not comfortable putting any amount of money on that right now. The vice president is nothing until they become everything. Whether or not the main candidates acknowledge it, their 2024 vice presidential picks are actively auditioning to become the backup president, not just a cute support player. Vice presidential debates have typically gotten lower ratings than their presidential counterparts, but this year, I urge you not to tune them out, because there is a very real possibility that one of the people on that debate stage will become our acting president at some point before 2028. A VP debate has not been scheduled, but is expected to happen in August. Shout out to my newest supporters, as well as supporters in my royal tiers, and a very special shout out to my multi-platinum supporters, T, Latranger Lucas, Joshua Cole, Thomas Johnson, Sophia Sams, Anthony Giles, Tay, and Brett Piontek. Your generosity makes this channel what it is, so thank you. If you like this video, you'll also enjoy the one I made about how a second term of Trump will derail democracy. Thanks so much for watching. Have a good day. Bye-bye.